Hello CS112. Today I'll be going over a quick solution to the final exam review lab. I will timestamp each of these, so if you want to skip through, you can. So let's just get started. The very first thing we had to do was write a function that would write to a file. So we call it def words, and we would be given a string like this. And what we had to do is we had to write each of these individual words to a file in a new line if that word was more than 5 characters. That's just strictly greater than 5 characters. So let's just call our parameter sentence since we're going to be given a sentence. And then since we're writing to a file, we can just create, I'm going to call it out file because that is our output. And I'm going to open it in the mode of writing, which is W. And in the description, it did say result.txt, so that's what I'm going to be naming it as. And before I do anything else, I'm going to close this file. So outfile.close is very important you do this. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to split this entire string by the spaces, so it's kind of like a list. So I'm going to say, let's just call it words equals sentence dot split, and passing in no parameters by default is going to be just by a space. So now we have a list where every element is going to be a word in this list. If I say for I in words, if the length of I is greater than 5, then we are going to write that to our new file, which is outfile. So outfile.write I, but I'm not just going to write I because it does want a new line character. Like it does want everything on a new line. So I'm going to write I plus just a new line character. That will put everything on a new line. And then obviously I'm just going to close the file. There's nothing to really return here. So now I'm just going to call this file just to show you that it works. So words with, and I'll copy the string down here. So now our output file should look like this. So I'm going to save this. As you can see, when I list everything out, there is a result.txt. I think that's just from something I was doing before. Let me just go ahead and delete that file. So now as you can see, there's no result.txt. When I run it now, and I list everything out, result.txt was created and written to. So if I was to open up result.txt, we have the expected file output. I don't know why I have to right now. All right. So that is the solution to the first guy right here. Now task 2 is reading from a file. And so we're going to be reading from the same file we created in task 1. So we want to write a function called longest word that reads from a list of words from a file and returns the longest word as a list. If there's more than one word that is the longest, you want to add them both to the list. So this is kind of similar to the first one, except we need a special conditional to determine, if there's a tie to add them both in there. So I'm just going to call it def longest word, and we're just going to be given a file. So our file is going to look like this. So we really just want to iterate through it and check which is the longest. Now this is one of those longest algorithms, so there are a couple things we need to know. One is we want to have a return list because we want to return the biggest words as a list, even if it's just one word. And then also we want to have the big size and just know what the length of our biggest word is. So we need to keep track of both of those at the same time. It's very similar to some of our programming assignments. The input file will be given is going to be read from, it's going to be file, and it's going to be read from. Now again, in this mode here, this means that this file name has to exist wherever you're looking for it. In this case, we're looking just in the current directory. It has to exist. Up here, result.txt did not need to exist for this to work, but here, when you're reading, the reading file needs to exist if you want to open it. And just because I like working with lists, I'm going to create a variable called file list and set that equal to infile.readLines. You guys really should know what this does by now. So now I'm just going to iterate for I in file lists. I'm going to first and foremost strip off the new line character from each of these, because while it might just look like this in result.txt, if I was to print out I at this point, it would have a new line character at the end of each and every one of them because they're all on a new line. So the first thing I'm going to do to I is just say I equals I.strip, and I'm going to strip it by the new line character. Now, something I will say about strip is it only removes preceding and after characters, like the character you specify from a string. It won't get any of the characters within a string. So, strip can be tricky to use. I really suggest only using it when you are stripping the new line character from a specific line. So once we have that, we can now check if the length of I is bigger than the big size. So if we do find a word that is bigger than whatever is currently our biggest word, then we need to do two things. Well, more than two things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set big list back to an empty list. So if we had this as our current list and we had an even bigger word than this current tie, we would want to just get rid of all of these words, and we can do that by just setting it back to equal to an empty list. And then once we have that, we actually want to have big list dot append our I, because I is now our biggest word, and that's going to be the only word in our new list. And lastly, I want to say big size equals the length of I. So now I can compare the following words with against the size of the new biggest word. Now, elif I is equal to the size of the big size. So in this case, if we just had a list sunscreen and we came across the word surfboard, those are equal. So we want to have them share the big list. We want to be able to have more than one word in our big word list if they are the same size. And that's really all we have to do. Of course, we should say infile.close, and we always close before we return, because once we return, nothing else is read in our function here. So here I actually still have a test case, so that's good. It saves us a little time. Now to call this file here, we pass in the file name as a string, and then we just use our parameter name. It's that simple. So now to run this file, we get sunscreen and surfboard printed to the terminal. So now that we know that works, I'm just going to move on to task 3. Now we're going to be reading from and writing to a file. So given a file, we're going to be writing a function called numLines that will give us this information. We're going to write this information to another file. So we're going to be given a file like poem.txt. I literally just copy and pasted this into a file, poem.txt. So here, right now, I have poem.txt, as you can see. So if I was to just quickly view that here, it's the same thing as here, just to confirm. And I'm going to read through this. I'm going to count the total number of lines, and I'm going to have a line that says the longest line says, and then on the third line, what that actual longest line says. So just to go right through it, def numLines, and we are going to be given a file. The file we're given is the file we're going to read, so I'm going to call it infile equals open, and just, file is the parameter name, and we're going to read from this. Now we are also going to need an out file, which we are going to write to, and I'm going to open that, and it says to call it poem result.txt, so I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste that, and we are going to write to that file. And just so I don't forget, I'm going to say infile.close and out file, if I can type, .close. So now the algorithm that I'm going to use is going to be kind of, I feel like all file IO algorithms are generally pretty similar, but there are a couple steps to this specific question, and so I'm going to create those variables that I now need. So the first thing I'm going to do is obviously I'm going to make my infile into a list, because I just like working with lists more than files. So I'm going to say file list equals infile.readLines. Then I'm going to create my numLines variable, because we want to return the number of lines. So right now I'm going to say numLines equals 0, because we have not counted any lines yet. I'm going to also create the longest line variable and set that equal to 0 as well, because right now our longest line is a width of 0 characters because we haven't looked for anything yet. And then I'm actually going to have the long, let's call this long line, and I'm going to change this to long size, because we need to keep track of what the size is of the longest line, and as well as what the longest line actually is. So now I'm just going to directly iterate through the file list which I created. And now I can say, the first thing I want to do is just say numLines plus equals 1, because I'm just going to count every single time we have a line. And then I'm going to check if the length of I is greater than the long size. Then I'm going to have to do 3 things. One is I'm going to set long size equal to the length of I, because we now have a new greatest size. I'm going to set long line equal to whatever that specific line was. And then I'm going to say long line equals long line dot strip. I'm going to strip that new line character off. I'm actually not, I'm going to do this part afterwards, because that could actually lead to a bug that I just thought of. So I'm going to do that down here. And I did a capital I for some reason. That doesn't exist. All right. So now that we've iterated through the entire list and we've found whatever the longest line was, we can now start writing to this file here. So the first thing I'm going to do, like I said, is I'm just going to say long line equals long line dot strip the new line character, because we don't want that new line character in our output. Now that I've done that, I'm going to create these 3 lines here. And I'm just going to leave them as a comment. So, oopsies. So the first thing I'm going to say is outFile.write, and then whatever that sentence is, which is total number of lines, a colon, and then our total lines variable, right? numLines. Oopsies. Our numLines variable, which in this case I'm going to have to convert to a string since I'm concatenating. So that should get us that first line. However, is that it? No, it's not. We want to have it on a new line. So I'm going to add a new line character. And I'm going to say outFile.write, just a sentence, the longest line says, with the new line character. And then our last line, outFile.write. Now this is where I need to actually write whatever I was, so whatever our long line was, except I need it to be in quotes. So how can I do that? Well, by using that little escape delimiter thing. So something like this. So this little backslash here will make this kind of like an invisible character, so it won't mess up our strings quotes. That's how we would work with that. And then I'm just going to call it, like, long line and then plus, and then the same exact thing to get that quote to show up in our string. So now if I was to run this on poem.txt, as you can see right now, there is no poem results. That's what I called it, right? Yeah, poem result.txt. But when I run this file now, we got an error, so we can debug this together. So right now, if the length of I is greater than long line, so I should have said long size here, because size is our integer that we are checking against. So now we got no errors. So now when I list everything out, we have poem result.txt. So if I was to open up poem result.txt, as you can see, we get the correct output here. So moving along to the next task, which is task 4. This is a dictionary question, and this is actually going to be the same exact algorithm if you guys saw my practice exam as the frequency function. So I'm just going to power through it real quick. So we're going to create a function called numberDict that essentially is given you're going to be given a string of numbers, and you want to return the frequency of each of the numbers. So in this case, all the keys are going to be each of the numbers, and the values are going to be the amount of times that number shows up in the string. And this is what it would look like. Obviously, the keys are sorted here, but that's not always going to be the case because dictionaries are unordered. So in this case, we're going to be given the number. I'm just going to call it number even though it's a string. I'm going to create my result dictionary, set that equal to an empty dictionary. I don't know if you guys have learned default dict. I'm assuming you haven't because that requires importing libraries, so never mind. For I in number. Now, like, what do I want to do in here as I'm iterating through number? So obviously right now, if I was to print I, I'd be getting each of these characters or, integers that I'm going to be checking for. So there are two possible cases, right? One is it already exists within this dictionary, and we want to increment its value because that we saw it a second time, or it is our first time seeing it, so we want to create that new key value pair. So I'm first going to create that new key value pair. So if I check if I not in my results, the in operator on a dictionary only checks to see if I is a key within that dictionary, not the values. It will not check any of the values. It will only check against the keys. So if it is not a key in the dictionary, then I'm going to create a new key value pair where I say results I equals 1 because that's the first time we're seeing it. So now this will create a new key value pair. However, if we've already seen it, then I can simply say results at the key I is going to be incremented. So we're just going to increment it because we've seen result before. This is our next time seeing it, so we've seen it another time, which is why I'm just saying plus equals 1. And then I'm just going to say return result, and that is it. So now if we were to call this function, we would get the expected output. As I said before, mine is not sorted. The keys are not sorted because, they're not supposed to be. Because it's a dictionary, it doesn't matter. As long as the keys and the value pairs are equivalent, they're going to be equal in Python. Now that is not true for ordered containers like lists. So now moving on to task 5, we're going to be using a dictionary. Now this one, again, is pretty straightforward. We're going to be given a dictionary as well as a list, and we want to essentially just find the total cost of those two TVs. So the TV names are going to be the keys, and their cost is going to be the value. So what is this called? Def tot cost. And the parameter name, let's just call it TV dictionary, and then TV list, because we're just given a list in a dictionary. I don't really have much of an imagination this early, but now I'm going to create a total variable, just set that equal to 0. I'm going to iterate through the TV list, because that's what we're working with here. And then I'm going to say total plus equals what? Well, the value of this key. So when I'm iterating through TV lists, we know that these the strings inside TV lists are all going to be keys that we are searching for. So now I can use I, since I is going to be each of these strings, as a key to just add it to. So TV dict at the key I. So the dictionary name plus the key is going to unlock the value. So this is just going to simplify to the value and add it to our total. And then we're just going to say return total. And now if I wanted to test this, I'm going to go down here, print, and that's, when I run it, we get 560, which is the expected output. So now, task 6, which has to do with loops. Write a function called count that takes an integer and calculates a number based on the following criteria, and then you're given a bunch of if statements. So my best advice for these types of questions, when you have a bunch of conditionals for some specific, factor that you need to count, you always want to check the most specific ones first, and I'll show you what I mean by that right now. So def counts, we're going to be given, let's just call it num. Again, I'm going to create a result variable and just set it equal to 0 because we're finding some sort of summation from 1 to up to this number. First of all, how can I calculate from 1 up to the number? Well, for I in the range of 1 to num plus 1. So the reason I'm doing from 1 is because we don't want to include 0 in our summation because it says 1 up to the parameter, and the range is exclusively ending. So if I just had put num here, then the range of 5 would have been 1, 2, 3, 4. I need to do num plus 1 to get that 5 since we want to include that. So here we're kind of adjusting the range completely by moving the 0 over 1 and then as well as the end over 1, so we can actually just get that entire range. I'm not going to edit out that yawn because I don't believe in editing. So now, like I said before, we want to check the most specific conditions first. The most specific one obviously being this guy right here, where it's checking if it's both divisible by 5 and 7. So I'm going to check if I modulus 7 equals 0 and I modulus 5 is equal to 0. Then what am I going to do? I'm just going to add only 5. So the reason that we want to check this one first is because if we had another conditional like just this first, then it would add 7 and that would be incorrect. So we want to always check the most absolutely like very specific ones first. And then we just go down in order from most specific to least specific. So the next two more specific ones are going to be these. It doesn't matter which order you do those in. And then this is kind of just like your default case. So I'm going to use an elif statement and say elif I modulus 7 is equal to 0. We're just going to add 7, so results, if I can type, result plus equals 7. Elif I mod 5 is equal to 0. Then we're going to say results plus equals 5. And our default just else, if these conditions are not true, we're going to subtract 1. So results minus equals 1, and then we're just going to return the results. Now down here, if I was to actually print out these test cases, we should get 1, 10, and 25, which we do. So now, moving on to our next guy, let's just get rid of these. Task 7, two-dimensional loops. So here we're going to be given a 2D list. As you can see, you got each of these sublists where each of these sublists have a specific, some strings, and we're going to be given 2 characters. The first character we're given is a beginning character, and the second is an ending character. What we want to do is we want to return a list of words where either it starts with the beginning character or ends with the ending character. So I guess the hardest part of this is figuring out how we can get to and check each of these characters. Well, it's going to be easiest with a nested loop. So I'm going to call this word beg or ends, and I'm going to have 3 parameters. I'm just going to call the 2D list dogs. I'm going to call the beginning variable beg and the ending character end. And I'm going to use a nested loop in my solution. So I'm going to set my results equal to an empty list because we're returning an empty list. And then I'm going to say for I and dogs, right now I is going to be each of these entire sublists here, and I want to know how I can get to each of these strings. Well, that's just simply adding another level to that. So now J, I'm iterating through I, which is a sublist. J is now going to be this entire string. And now we don't even need to know what the length of these strings are to grab that last index, because as you know, there is negative indexing in Python, which works on indexable containers. So -1 is always going to be whatever the last index is. So I can check if j at 0 is going to be equivalent to the beginning variable, or if j at -1 is equal to the ending character. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to say result.appends just that word, which is j. All right, and that is literally it. So now just return results. And now I don't have a test case here, so I'm just going to make one. I think that's good. Now if I was to run this, we get the expected output. Now, just to reiterate, that this needed to match this expected output. If my output, if the expected output was like this, and then collie back here, so, these are not equal. Like this and this are not equal since lists are ordered in Python, whereas dictionaries are unordered, so as long as the key value pairs match, they're going to be considered equal. And I think that was it. That was test 7. So good luck on finals tomorrow. If you have any questions, let us know.